Hi. First, thank you all for joining, and thanks to CCPO and ICAR for having me here today. I'm happy to join virtually. And before I get into sort of the research talk that focuses on cultural ecosystem services, I thought, given the interdisciplinary group potentially and interdisciplinary interest, it might be useful to look at my background, which on paper seems a lot more sort of straight and narrow than it actually is. And so I started at University of Michigan. I got my BS in anthropology, zoology, but that was not at all cultural anthropology. It was looking at lots of skulls and teeth and animal bones. And so I started sort of with a different approach to anthropology. And it was there that I started thinking about marine science more. And between my bachelor's and master's, wanted to focus more on marine science and thinking about the human impact on systems. And so you'll see that my sort of perspective on humans and ecosystems has also sort of spun around over this time. But so I interned in Dana Wetzel's ecotoxicology lab at Mote Marine, which is now their forensic toxicology lab, but was looking at the long-term effects of the Exxon Valdez oil spill in Alaska. And so looking at petroleum aromatic hydrocarbons in marine mammal, fish, and sediment. And then started my master's at UNC Wilmington with a conservation focus. And so I used stable isotopes to look at seasonal ecology of three marsh sparrows, that sort of the human connection there. It was a little bit more tangential, but with the idea that these sparrows could be indicator species for salt marshes and a way to tell if salt marsh health had been compromised or not. And I also started working for Audubon, North Carolina then as a field technician. So I was doing coastal ecology and helping manage shorebird sanctuaries. But this is where things started to shift a little bit, and I started to get the glimmer of the human dimensions that ended up being my path. And I was working on a sort of side project that was added instead of the coastal bird work, where I was looking for the ivory-billed woodpecker, which if anyone is a birder, you may or may not know that the ivory-billed is extinct. But this was part of a nationwide search effort after a potential resighting in Arkansas. And so it was during this work in the swamps surrounding Lake Waccamaw and the Lumber River in North Carolina, where I started working with local communities to find better tracts of swamp and think about if the bird was there, where it might be, and talking with them about the different birds that they saw. And that's sort of where I started to see the value that local ecological knowledge was providing to my own research. And so making the research stronger, making the science stronger. And so I didn't immediately sort of shift onto the human side just yet, but moved up to Maryland and was managing Ken Painter's lab. And working there, we focused on oyster restoration monitoring primarily. And so with the restoration that was happening in the upper portion of the bay, doing the sort of population assessment and dive monitoring, but also working with commercial watermen. And so it was then that I finally sort of made the move. But in working with watermen, I had the chance to hear their perspectives on how oysters were being managed in the Chesapeake and get a lot of opinions and thoughts on how that could be changed or how sort of things had gone thus far. And that's when I decided to go back to school. And so my PhD is cultural anthropology, no bones. But I focused on aquaculture initially in Maryland, and then it expanded beyond the Chesapeake, but looking at oyster aquaculture and clam aquaculture and some of the motivations for people getting into it, how they were diversifying, if they were adding it as one of many jobs or sort of shifting all the way in, and then thinking about cultural ecosystem services, which we'll talk about today. And from Maryland, then I started my postdoc with Bill Walton at the Auburn Shellfish Lab that was focused on shellfish aquaculture, but sort of the other end of the chain. And so I was focused on the food service sector, looking at chefs and seafood buyers and sort of how their perceptions changed depending on if a product was farmed or wild and where sort of some of the distinction was. And from there, that's when I started with NOAA in Miami as a contractor and was the aquaculture social scientist with my primary task thinking about the social and community impacts of potential offshore aquaculture. And I'm still involved with that and have continued some of that work since I joined VIMS. And so I'm only just over a year into joining the faculty here at VIMS. And as Tom said, I have the Communities and Coast Lab. So this is my research group here. And sort of the broad umbrella of what I do is focused on the implications of social ecological change with a lot of attention given to aquaculture. Still, much of my sort of portfolio centers on aquaculture, but also fisheries and offshore development. And so that offshore includes lots of different things and thinking about the blue economy and more recently here in Virginia and other parts of the Southeast thinking about offshore wind. And some of the projects that are happening in my research group now, continuing some of the work that I started with NOAA, looking at social acceptability of aquaculture with a focus on areas that they're looking at offshore in the Gulf of Mexico, Southern California, and Alaska. I also have an undergraduate student, Savra Srivastava, who is looking at resilience and adaptation in Maryland's oyster industry. So thinking about in terms of language and how we're describing these transitions, if it is an indicator of resilience or more adaptability. And I had an RU student from Humboldt that came over this summer and did interviews with women in Virginia's shellfish aquaculture industry, looking at their experience and perspective of how the industry and the environment has changed since they've joined it. We're also working on shoreside impacts of offshore wind, and that's a project with Andrew Sheld and Shelby White here, and also working with Andrew and his student Kayla Gilsonen, as well as Bill Walton and Andrew Opicki, who's down at the University of Florida, and Karen Hudson here, to look at labor supply and demand issues, and working in Virginia and Florida. This one started when I was still down in Miami, but so we're looking at industries in both states to see some of the concerns related to labor. And then one other example is, again, thinking at the other end of the supply chain here, but evaluating a server training program. So there's a nonprofit called Oyster South that has been running these restaurant trainings to teach people how to talk about farmed oysters. And I'm involved in post-training interviews and evaluation to understand how these trainings have impacted the restaurants. And so that's sort of a smattering of the work that's happening now as I'm getting started here at VIMS. But today, wanted to talk about, and I'm going to try to keep an eye on time, today talking about cultural ecosystem services. And so I'll be presenting some of this work with first just an overview of ecosystem services to make sure we're all starting on the same page, then talking about shellfish and specifically trying to identify cultural ecosystem services, and then thinking about how people value those services and benefits, what's important, what's not, summarizing it, talk about the broader implications, and then have time for questions and discussion, hopefully. And so first, just to get started, when we're talking about ecosystem services, so typically we're thinking of this definition that came from the Millennium Assessment in 2005. Ecosystem services broadly are the benefits that people obtain from ecosystems. And when we're talking about bivalve shellfish, we have examples here. There's 4 different categories of ecosystem service, and bivalves are noted for the connection to all of those. And so first, with provisioning services, these are the products obtained from the ecosystem, the raw materials. And from the Pacific Shellfish Institute, these examples that are listed are with oysters in mind, but most of them are also true for other filter feeding bivalves. And so as a provisioning service, oysters contribute to wild fisheries. And so the meat, the tissue that people eat, also the shell is a raw material that can be used in fertilizer, building, jewelry, other decorations. There's also regulating services. And so these are the benefits obtained from the regulation of ecosystem processes. And with filter feeders like oysters, they contribute to water quality maintenance. They also form habitat and contribute to storm surge protection, shoreline, reducing shoreline erosion, and helping to stabilize submerged land. Then we have cultural services, which don't have as many examples because they haven't been studied as much, but they're the non-material benefits obtained from ecosystems. And often you'll hear tourism, recreation, symbolism associated with coastal heritage. More recently, people are talking more about sense of place and contribution to well-being. And I'll get into many more examples of cultural services in the slides that follow. Then finally, we have the 4th category, supporting ecosystem services, which these are the foundational services that are necessary for the production of others. And when we're thinking again about these filter feeding bivalves, they're contributing to nutrient cycling in their local waters. And in providing habitat, they're also providing nurseries for lots of species, including commercially targeted species. And so when we're talking about bivalve shellfish and the suite of ecosystem services they provide, often people think about these 2 that are on the right because of the associated environmental benefits. So we hear about how that shellfish aquaculture, bivalve shellfish aquaculture, can provide an environmental good. And so that's what gets promoted a lot. My interest, not surprisingly as an anthropologist, is in the cultural ecosystem services. And so this was where my work was centered. But in thinking about it, I didn't like the definition non-material benefits. It's hard to go ask a fisherman, for example, tell me the non-material benefits you obtain through your work. And so I wanted something that was a little bit more tangible, a little easier for people to connect with. And this is important. So cultural services themselves are understudied, as I noted, and they've also been noted that they're important to individuals and communities. And so in some of my earlier work looking at motivation to get into aquaculture, I found that oyster growers in Maryland, framed under a lens of ecosystem services, overwhelmingly had cultural motivators rather than these other types of ecosystem services. And I'd note that this doesn't include income. If I included income in that, then sort of the number of participants noting cultural services would have gone even higher. But so these were sort of the motivations to think about why I wanted to study cultural services. But again, trying to think about a way to talk with people about this without saying non-material benefits, without saying cultural ecosystem services a million times. It's not the cleanest language to use sort of in the lay conversation. And so in looking for other definitions and other ways to come about it, there was a framework by Fish et al. That came out in 2016 that framed cultural ecosystem services as something that arises through cultural practices, so a resource-based livelihood or work, for example, like farming clams, in environmental spaces, so the rivers and creeks surrounding the eastern shore of Virginia, as an example, to produce cultural ecosystem benefits. And getting at more simpler language, they talked about these benefits as the contributions made to human well-being in terms of identities, experiences, and capabilities. And so the identities that are framed by work with shellfish, experiences enabled by work with shellfish, and capabilities that are equipped through work with shellfish. And so this was the framing that I used. And so you'll see identities, experiences, and capabilities coming up again. And so the research questions that I had with this were one, quite basically to understand what are the cultural ecosystem services enabled through work in shellfish aquaculture. As I noted, there's been limited work with cultural ecosystem services in general compared to other types of ecosystem services. And this was especially true with bivalves. And so trying to expand that list, so beyond recreation, tourism, symbolism associated with coastal heritage, what were the different benefits that people were getting from their work with shellfish that were sort of not the typical ones that we might think of, but are common and even more common than those others. And then wondering in terms of valuation. So when I talk about value, often it's not economic value, it's more driven from individual perspective and how people think about it. And so are some benefits or services more important than others, and what is driving and shaping those perceived values? Then I also wanted to know if shellfish aquaculture could provide the same types of ecosystem services, specifically cultural ecosystem services, as wild fisheries in similar systems. And so this last question was important in places where the wild fishery may not be as strong as it once was or as healthy. Often commercial harvesters are encouraged to consider aquaculture, but it's not necessarily one-to-one or comparing apples and oranges. So I wanted to know, thinking about these cultural benefits, maybe as a proxy for job satisfaction, which is generally high in commercial fisheries, could shellfish aquaculture match that sort of high level of job satisfaction? And then ultimately thinking about all of this is what it means for industry management, development, and just local communities in general. And so we'll walk through two studies here. The first one, again, asking the very basic of what are the cultural ecosystem services associated with bivalve shellfish, and specifically getting at them through work with shellfish. And so to answer this question, I scoped this out with 3 regions in mind. And so I wanted to have 3 regions to see if there was diversity and variety in what people were thinking about as these benefits, and also trying to capture industries of different scale and age. And so I focused on New England, the Chesapeake Bay, and the Gulf of Mexico, targeting 2 states in each region. And you'll see I got a bonus down in the Gulf. But so in New England, I was focused on Rhode Island and Massachusetts, and specifically was in Massachusetts was along the Cape rather than the entire state. In the Chesapeake Bay, I was in Virginia and actually stayed right close to VIMS here, but covered both the eastern and western shore in Virginia. Maryland, it was focused on the eastern shore, specifically over around Cambridge and Hooper's Island. In the Gulf of Mexico, I covered Florida from Cedar Key up through the Panhandle to Pensacola. In Alabama, the entire coastline of the state. And while I was down in Alabama, I had the opportunity to go work with some growers in Mississippi that were in their first year. And so they hadn't taken a product to market yet. They hadn't sold any oysters yet, but were interested in participating in the project. So I took advantage of that opportunity. And in total, I had 218 participants, and you can see sort of the breakdown by state, not as many in Mississippi, but again, those are brand new farmers and they were an add-on to the project, but had a fairly good response rate. And so I spent at least 2 months in each state working with growers and commercial harvesters and conducting the interviews. And I'll get into those methods a little bit more on the next slide. But in total, thinking about the participants in this project, it was a combination of commercial shellfish growers, wild harvesters, and a third category that I'll call industry support. And so these are folks that make a living off of shellfish. So their income is tied to shellfish, but they're not shellfish farmers or growers. They're not wild harvesters. They're doing things maybe gear manufacturer or resource manager or extension specialist or a research scientist. So they're sort of industry adjacent and supporting the shellfish industry in different ways. And so to get at these sort of questions and thinking about what these benefits are, I used a combination of participant observations. So I went out and worked with shellfish farmers and wild harvesters in each of these states. As much as they will allow. In some cases, that was multiple days with folks. Some cases, it may have been half a day. But the idea was to really get a feel for the industry, the work, and to see some of these differences from community to community and how the businesses and operations were working. I also did semi-structured interviews with all 218 participants. So using an interview guide that targeted the benefits people get from their work, what they like about it, what are some of the things you enjoy about your work that you can't quite put a dollar on. And so thinking about that had a goal of thinking about cultural ecosystem services, but certainly didn't limit them to only cultural services and benefits. So other types came up. So I did hear about those environmental benefits as well. And then for those who are interested, I also did photo voice interviews. And so this certainly wasn't everybody's cup of tea, but of the 218, 38 folks did a follow-up interview where I had asked them to think about those same questions in the discussion that we had, but come back with photos that they had taken either with the interview in mind or maybe that they already had and sort of fit the bill. And so then we talked about the photos and how the photos illustrated those benefits. And for those of them that did participate, they seemed to really like the photo voice and prefer it. But again, 38 out of 218 shows photo voice is not a numbers game in trying to get interview data. And so for all the interviews, they were transcribed and coded using an open coding text analysis, where essentially I started with this sort of cursory list of benefits that I expected to come up, and then just kept building that list as I went through all the interviews, and then circled back and recoded everything with the complete list to make sure everything was captured. And then I analyzed the coded data to generate an overall list of benefits. I was also looking at frequency to see which ones were mentioned, what I deem high frequency. In this case, it was by more than 60 participants. I also looked at how services were mentioned linked to one another. So if the delivery of one benefit was contingent upon another, and how often that happened. And then thinking about this livelihood transition or just industry transition from wild fisheries to aquaculture, I wanted to know how the delivery of those benefits changed. So if there was a shift from a wild fishery to aquaculture, would those benefits be enhanced, and how would they be diminished? Would they stay the same? And so I coded for that also in response to specific questions that targeted that. And so now for the results here. So I'm only going to focus on the cultural ecosystem services in the interest of time. But again, other types of services and benefits did come up. But for the cultural ones, I have them framed again based on the fish framework, identities, experiences, and capabilities. And for each of these slides, they'll have the list of the different benefits that came up. And the photos that frame it are examples from the photo voice interviews. So each of these photos represents one of the identities on this page. And then for each list, I won't walk through every single item, but the ones that are in darker font, like contribution to community in this case, is one that was high frequency, mentioned by more than 60 people, whereas the other ones may not have been mentioned by as many. And so I'll walk through just a couple of these to give examples for the high frequency ones. And so thinking about identities enabled by work with shellfish, here's a shellfish hatchery employee, and this was someone up in Maryland, who said that the hatchery provides jobs and larvae. Farmers get seed and they get trained workers. That extends to wholesalers and the shops that farmers stop at on their way to work. There's a constant chain of jobs and increased labor opportunities. And so this employee was seeing the way that he potentially contributed to his community by helping to have this sort of ripple effect of jobs created by the seed that he was producing. And he even noted that week, he said there was a traffic jam. And so he's over on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, in an area that's not really known for traffic of any kind. And there was a traffic jam because of the number of people stopping to fuel up and get food at the Royal Farms. And so for him, that was something positive because he saw that as more activity and sort of local income generation that was sort of paying forward through the community based on this growth of the aquaculture industry. People also talked about experiences. And so there are many more experiences that were discussed that they got because of their work with shellfish. And in this case, 4 of them were high frequency. And I'll leave this up here a little bit just so people have time to look through all of them. But again, I'm not going to discuss all, but you can see in the photos, people had sort of different ways of thinking about the experiences, including some, the lower left was a waterman who was able to continue problem solving and working with his hands even as an oyster farmer now. And so there were a lot of different ways that people were thinking about it, thinking about the different challenges that came from the work and the connections that they made with others. And so as some of these examples of the high frequency, the first one, independence. And so this is something, regularly associated with a wild fishery. And in this case, the quote is from a wild harvester who said that the best thing, I guess, is the freedom. I have the ability to work at my own pace. I can do what I want to do. It's not like I'm dedicated to a 9 to 5. I work when I want to work. Sure, if I don't go out, I don't make money, but I'm in control. And so for many of the commercial fishermen, watermen, wild harvesters, this is one of the most important things about their work is that it's theirs, they control it. There's little oversight, even though they still have to have the right permits and have management, controlling what they're fishing and where. It's still, ultimately their choice if they choose to go out and harvest. And I did hear this sort of translation of a similar benefit from some of the shellfish farmers, where because they own their own business, they felt this similar sense of control. And so this is an example where it could be a benefit that is similar, not quite identical, but maybe there's different versions of it depending on how you're working with shellfish. Then a lot of people talked about lifestyle, and this was especially true of people that were coming in from non-fisheries based work before. So if they were coming from a desk job, they valued the lifestyle associated with their sort of new career in shellfish aquaculture. And so for this person who was a shellfish farmer, they said they get paid to go out on a boat. I get paid to swim in the ocean. It's fun. It's a fun job to have. I couldn't think of a better way to make a living. And so for this person, it was his first summer working on a farm on Cape Cod. And he was contrasting this to the previous jobs that he had. At least then he thought this one was going to stick. And so I'm not sure, years later if he's still farming oysters, but at that time he was very excited because of the lifestyle associated with it. Then we have another experience related to security. And so for this shellfish farmer who did, it was a former harvester who did transition fully as a shellfish farmer and was no longer doing wild harvest. And so he found that shellfish aquaculture can be organized to get a fresher product to market. It doesn't have to get harvested then sold. You can plan based on sales, when and what to harvest. And so this sort of gets back at that sense of control that farmers were talking about. But for this, they didn't have to go, catch what they could and hope they could sell it and have to sell at whatever price is being offered. But they had a little bit more control over their product and could leave it, in their floating gear or their bottom gear, whatever the case may be, and go harvest it when they're ready to sell it. And then we have social capital, which is our last example of a experience that was discussed. So the other high frequency mention. And so these are the connections between people. And so some of these are like this farmer, where it was the employees and the colleagues that he worked with. And so he said the most gratifying part is the camaraderie, the band of brothers, the shared hardship. I can trust these guys with my life. It's that shared experience of hardships, figuring out your limits and pushing through them. And so for him, and this was common, a lot of farmers talked about their crew and the people that they worked with every day. It also extended beyond the individual farm, where people talked about the community within the industry, and so that they were connecting with other shellfish farmers or other fishermen, and that social capital that was building. And they also talked about it outside of the industry with their ability to connect with the public, connect with people that maybe didn't know what an oyster farm was until they met this person and they were able to tell them what their job was. And that also came up a lot, just sort of the novelty of the occupation, that if somebody asks what you do and you say you're an oyster farmer, then that usually gets some follow-up questions. And then finally, the last category of cultural ecosystem service and these benefits is capabilities. And so this was a shorter list. People talked about income, knowledge, mental and physical health, as well as skills. And they talked about how they were able to build these capabilities for themselves, but also to share with others. And so the ability to train others and to help others learn about oyster aquaculture or clam aquaculture, or even just wild shell fisheries. And so the examples I have here for the high frequency with income, we have someone that said it's good money. I don't have to go out of town to make it. I don't have to leave my kids. And I pulled this one as the example related to income. I will say it's rare. A lot of people would say it's certainly not about the money, sort of jokingly, but this one acknowledged that it is decent money, and the fact that they don't have to leave town. And so this lost my headphone. This came up a lot, that it was a job that also had this. So it was income plus this. And so for this person, I don't recall, this could have been a Gulf shrimper. So I had a number of folks that used to do offshore shrimp fishing in the Gulf of Mexico and around. And so they would be gone for weeks, sometimes even months at a time. And shellfish aquaculture allowed them to be home and be in their bed every night and see their kids' soccer game. And it didn't necessarily require someone being offshore to have this feeling. There were others that in Cedar Key, for example, down in Florida, had been commuting over an hour because that's where the jobs were. And so they didn't have jobs available in Cedar Key and had previously been commuting. But when they got involved in clam aquaculture, then they likewise were able to be closer to home, closer to family, and not missing out on key events that they wanted to be there for. And then people talked about knowledge. And so for this shellfish farmer, he said, it's been really interesting to learn about the benefits of raising oysters this way and helping the state increase production of oysters. I've been preaching oyster farming to everyone we know and meet. I get excited. I want to learn more. I enjoy telling our story. It's the lagniappe. The lagniappe is that I'm excited about growing oysters and making money and eating them. And so for this farmer, if you know the term lagniappe, you may have correctly guessed that he was from down in the Gulf Coast. But so lagniappe is just the added bonus. So it's sort of the plus that comes with it. And this is another one where there's multiple things packed in here. So he's talking about things that he's learned and that he's been able to share with others. But he's also talking about these provisioning services, that he's eating oysters. He's also making money. And so tying into income there. And so both of these quotes and thinking about these links get into that other question of how connected are all of these benefits. And so to answer that, I did take all of my coding and analyzed it and threw it into a network analysis to look at how they're linked. And the intent of this image is not for you to sort of see how each individual one is connected, but just to show that for all of these, so the cultural services are here in gray, the provisioning services are light blue, the regulating and supporting services are the royal blue. All of them are connected to another. There wasn't a single benefit mentioned that was a standalone. And so when you're thinking about ecosystem service accounting and thinking about valuation in the economic sense, it makes it more challenging to think about it, so that these services are complex. The benefits are all linked to one another. And so it makes that math a little bit more complicated. And then finally, the last bit for this study was thinking about this transition from wild fisheries to shellfish aquaculture and understanding how those benefits may or may not change. So I'd asked targeted questions specific to this to think about which benefits changed, how they changed, if it was a good or a bad change. And what came out of this was, of the 46 benefits that were noted, 8 were identified as not changing. So there was no difference between a wild fishery and shellfish aquaculture. 14 were perceived as being enhanced or improving with shellfish aquaculture. And in some cases, these might be benefits that didn't exist with wild fisheries, but do exist with shellfish aquaculture, or maybe were enhanced. Then 2 of them were perceived as diminished. And so for these 2 that were diminished with the transition of aquaculture, the first one was thrill of the hunt, which that makes sense. So for a wild fishery, thrill of the hunt is another thing that contributes to job satisfaction, sort of the pleasure of finding the fish or finding the shellfish that you're looking for and being successful at it, and sort of demonstrating that you're good at what you do by being able to find it. And that question of, you don't know what you're going to find that day. And a lot of people acknowledge that if you had the thrill of the hunt with aquaculture, you might be doing it wrong. If you're hunting for your farmed product, then maybe you need to rethink your business plan. And so that was one that came up as something diminished with aquaculture. The other one that came up was interesting in that people weren't thinking about it from their own perspective, but thinking about what outsiders might think. And that was aesthetic appreciation. So where they maybe thought a farm was aesthetically pleasing and appreciated it and thought it was, beautiful or picturesque, they thought that maybe upland property owners or, wealthy waterfront property owners may not have that same opinion. And so that was one that they thought might be diminished with that shift. And then finally, the majority of those benefits were perceived as both enhanced or diminished, depending on who I was talking to. And so for me, that sort of really showed the effect of and the importance of perspective in thinking about these changes if the fishery were to shift to aquaculture. And so a quick summary of that first part, and then I'll walk through the second. And looks like we're still okay on time. So with this study, we have the first list of cultural services associated with shellfish collected via systematic effort. It demonstrated the number of linked benefits and the complexity of ecosystem service calculation with these linkages. And what I found was that shellfish aquaculture generally matches or enhances benefits relative to wild fisheries, but perspective matters. And it's this question of perspective that inspired me to conduct the next study. And so I wanted to know if some ecosystem services and benefits are more important than others to individuals and what's driving these perceived values. And so to get at this question, I did a different approach. This was an online survey, and I expanded my range. So it was a nationwide survey. And again, thinking about my participants in these 3 different categories. So I had shellfish growers, wild harvesters, and industry support. And with this one, the difference was I asked them to think of only one identity and only one role when they completed the survey. So even if they were both a shellfish grower and a wild harvester, at the beginning of the survey, they had to pick one and think about it that way for the rest of the survey. And so I added the little star here with our wild harvesters because there were only 5 who completed the survey as a wild harvester. But there were 27 that actually had a background in wild harvest. They just didn't sort as such. And this becomes important when we're thinking about the results. And you can see that from this, so I had a lot of representation from participants in the Chesapeake Bay and the Gulf of Mexico, and then also had participants from the Northeast in gray. And so these were those 3 regions that I conducted the interviews. So I guess it makes sense. And I was pleased to see that people still wanted to continue participating in my projects. But so I had most representation there, but did get additional representation from North Carolina, as well as Alaska and Washington for this. And so with this survey was a Q survey. And if you're not familiar with Q methodology, I will sort of do a crash course walkthrough of how this works. And hopefully it doesn't get too crazy as things get added to this figure. But so with Q methodology, the intent is to be able to systematically, but also subjectively look at viewpoints on a topic. And so for this, I was interested in how people valued and sort of ranked in terms of importance what these benefits were. The idea wasn't to create an ultimate list 1 through 46 of the most important benefit and the least important benefit, but to think about how people are conceptualizing these benefits and if there are different value systems shaping how they're thinking. So with the idea that there are multiple perspectives within a population, but are there some commonalities? So could we sort of distill this down to 5 different ways of thinking about these benefits, for example? And so to do this, I had that list of 46 benefits that I translated into 49 statements. And these statements were put on little cards. And so if I was doing this in person, that would be physical index cards that I asked people to sort. In the digital world, it was a little box on the computer screen that they could click and drag into the pyramid. And so with this, the pyramid, they're sorting it into, so it's sort of forcing a normal distribution, but with things that are least important to the left, things that are most important to the right. So it enables a relative comparison of importance for all of these benefits, and where they land vertically doesn't matter. It's all about the left to right. And so the participants that took part in this ended up sorting all 49 statements. And so I had 74 different sorts, so 74 pyramids from 74 folks. And then from there, it is a form of a factor analysis using a principal components analysis with varimax rotation to identify the best fit. And so looking at how many factors or how many different viewpoints best represent the data. And so looking at this, what ended up being the best fit, and I had tested anywhere from just 1 factor up through 10, the best fit was only 3 factors, and it covered 63 of the sorts. So there were 11 participants who weren't captured by these 3 factors, but 3 factors still seem to be the best fit for the data set overall. And so with Q methodology, the idea is that you're not only trying to look at how many different factors are represented, but what those factors say about those perspectives. And so what does that grouping tell you about in the way that they sorted? And so you get an average or representative sort, the archetype sort for each of these factors. And so on the screen here, you can see the factors for A, B, and C are 3 different groups. And what I'd like you to get out of this image is, so again, using the same color coding as that network slide, we have cultural services in gray, provisioning in light blue, regulating and supporting in royal blue, and then there were a couple of the statements that were both cultural and provisioning that are here in white. But if you do sort of just a glance, you can see with those royal blue, for example, that group A had their regulating and supporting services sort of valued moderately, middle of the road. And again, we don't care where height-wise they are, just left to right. Whereas group B had more value placed on those. They were skewed to the right with the regulating and supporting services, and group C had those ranked a little bit lower, skewed to the left. And so you can see that there are differences in the way that these sorts occurred, thinking about different ecosystem service categories. And what I found was that there were very few benefits that were ranked similarly across all 3 groups. So there was very few uniform patterns in the data set. One that was ranked high across all 3, or at least relatively high, was number 22, and that was pride in your work. So pride in one's work was important to all 3 groups. And then there were a couple that were ranked low for all 3 groups. So number 24 was a spiritual experience that happens because of your work. And number 47, which was consistently the lowest for all 3 groups, related to shell collecting and using shell as a sort of hobby. And so those were the only patterns across all 3. I also was looking to see if the interviews and those high frequency mentioned in interviews correlated to importance here. And what I found, not really. And so high frequency didn't equal high importance. And the only ones that were both high frequency and ranked high in these factor groups were lifestyle, which was ranked only high for group C, knowledge, which was only ranked high for group A, income, which was only ranked high for group B, and then challenge, which was ranked high for both A and C. And I also wanted to make sure, because I had people participating in this survey that did not participate in the interviews, wanted to make sure that the benefits that came out of those interviews were still meaningful for the people doing the survey. And so in addition to asking them to sort, I had asked them to indicate if any were irrelevant or didn't make sense for their work. And the only place where this came up was with group A, that acknowledged that those provisioning services didn't really mean anything to them. That wasn't something that was unimportant. It just wasn't really relevant to what they do. And this makes sense when we see sort of how the groups shook out a little bit on the next slide. But and so for that, even though they're ranked low importance, it was more that they just weren't relevant. And so I wanted to see what might be driving these viewpoints before I started to describe what the viewpoints were. And in looking at that, I had lots of participant data and sort of characteristics and metadata description that included region, the state they were in, their zip code, what species they worked with, whether they, how old they were, what gender they were, and sort of a lot of things that I looked at to see if there were any patterns. And I didn't find any, except for when I looked at their industry role, which was, I guess, pleasantly surprising that it was as clean as it was. But so with this, we have factor A. You can see the darker gray, we had mostly industry support made up factor A, whereas factors B and C weren't that different, aside from B having more people fall into it, more shellfish growers, but B and C were majority shellfish growers, but also included wild harvesters and industry support. And I'll also note that one of the concerns with not all sorts loading on these factors, so remember there were 11 that weren't captured by the 3 factors, would be that the small sample of wild harvesters wasn't reflected. But since all 5 were captured in here, I was less worried that that small sample size would render their data not part of it. And so then the final piece to this puzzle is trying to describe those sorts. So with those sort of archetype pyramids, looking at how people rank them and what story that tells. And so this is where it gets to be a little bit more subjective, trying to describe how they were thinking about it. But what I found, so I labeled each group, I gave each group a name. And so my factor A group are the improvers of self, society, and ecosystem. And the way that they sorted suggests that they value personal development and self-improvement, ranking high benefits related to knowledge and skill building, as well as innovation and challenge. They also were proud of their successes. And so they ranked high benefits related to achieving success through their own abilities and also being part of a network working towards larger goals or common goals. And again, most of these folks were industry support. And so also flipping back to this, provisioning services that are on the left side of the sort that aren't important for these people, the majority of them are not producing and selling that product themselves, the actual animal. And so it sort of makes sense that maybe the raw materials weren't as important for this group. Then for factor B, who I called the sustainable providers, they ranked high benefits related to pride in their ability to produce a food product, and specifically a superior or high quality food product. They also ranked high the environmental benefits and the sustainability of what they were doing. And then there were several statements that related to sort of VIP experiences with nature, and that these were experiences that they had specifically because of their job, and that not everyone had that. And so that was also ranked high. And what was interesting, if you remember, like factor C, this group was mostly shellfish growers, but they were shellfish growers who previously worked outside of shell fisheries. And so they didn't do wild harvest before getting into aquaculture. And you'll see how that contrasts with factor C, who I called the shellfisher folk. And so for this group, they place a high value on occupational identity, ranking high benefits associated with the lifestyle, sense of place, and personal identity. They also ranked high things related to their role in the seafood industry as seafood providers and continuing a local way of life. And contrasting with factor B, these shellfish growers did have a background in wild harvest. And so I would suspect that if more wild harvesters sorted as wild harvesters, they might fall into this group. Or if there were shellfish growers also that had done or continue to do wild harvest, they may be more likely to think like these shellfisher folk. And so to wrap up this sort of benefits evaluation, what I saw is that the viewpoints were largely driven by industry role, thinking about how those factors separated out. There were few benefits that were high value to all groups. And I found that high frequency in those initial interviews didn't translate to high importance when people were asked to rank them. But I did find that the list of benefits that was generated is relevant to the industry broadly. Maybe not necessarily industry support, but for the actual growers and farmers themselves and the commercial fishermen, the benefits did seem to hit home with them. And so then going back to my original research questions that I threw out there at the beginning, so just essentially what are those cultural ecosystem services associated with bivalve aquaculture? I found that there were many, and this created the first detailed list of cultural ecosystem services associated with shell fisheries. Are some services and benefits more important than others, and what's driving that value? I found that yes, some are more important, but it's not absolute. And so that viewpoints were driven by industry role. And then lastly, can shellfish aquaculture provide the same types of ecosystem services as wild fisheries in similar systems? I found that, yeah, maybe for the most part. Perspectives vary, but shellfish aquaculture does seem to have the potential to provide similar benefits, but there were a small number of exceptions. And I think those exceptions are sort of important things to center in and hone in on for the consideration of how to apply this work and sort of the next steps. And so what does this mean for aquaculture management, industry development, and local communities? And so some of the ways I see this sort of translating and the implications of it is using ecosystem service speak, pluralistic valuation. And so that's just the idea that there are these multiple perspectives. And so when you're thinking about fisheries management and even simply industry promotion for both wild and farm, recognizing that a one-size-fits-all approach won't matter, that certain benefits will be more important to others and might resonate more strongly with others, and being able to do so with these different tailored approaches in mind. And that translates to industry promotion. So thinking about this list of benefits is really a list of good things about shell fisheries, both wild and farmed. And so still just thinking about the good things may not resonate with everyone. And so being able to tailor that message for specific groups when you're thinking about industry promotion or creating media related to it. And I think, as I said, that the diminish and enhance services and these sort of issues of contention potentially is a good way to think about sort of next steps. And so thinking about these as talking points, for example, not necessarily with industry, which is still important, but thinking about communities that may be a little oppositional to aquaculture or even wild fisheries, understanding how they think these benefits could change to hurt them or how they think the industry is impacting them could be a way to identify solutions, or at least mitigation, and try to think about how that could impact local communities. And then finally, thinking about livelihood transitions, thinking about how these social benefits change may be important for people considering whether they're coming from wild fisheries or not, what this sort of new job might mean for them and could be useful for industry recruitment. And so with that, I'll thank all 300-ish participants that contributed to this project, including the photographers that provided photos that were used today, my committee members and co-authors on some of the work, local introductions in each of the states that I worked in, as well as my funding sources. And I also want to thank all of you for tuning in today and for the invitation to be here to present. And I'm happy to take any questions that anyone may have.
Thank you, Dr. Michaelis. Yeah, that's excellent. And lots of questions could be posed. Folks, you can unmute yourself or raise your hand, or simple as drop a question in the chat, and I'll be happy to pass it on. I am prepared with one as well, but
I'll stop sharing my screen, assuming people can find that if they want.
Yep. I'll break the ice on this then. Yeah, 300 as your total participants. It's quite large across the projects. But as a geographer, I cannot help but ask, and I think you alluded to it in one inference about the geographic maybe variation. So, you know, some of the communities that may be like transitioning, I guess, from wild to farming, you know, do the communities in you know, beyond the farmers themselves have that sense of you know, the tradition? So I guess I just wonder, is geography a variable? You know, maybe not explicitly, but maybe like a residual or something you could interpret in some of your results. You know, like, you know, place-based issues of like Chincoteague and the ocean side versus bay side, kind of on the eastern shore. Just thinking about geographic variation.
So thinking about geography, that was certainly something I was thinking of, and I had some sort of expectations going into it. I didn't see a ton of variation in terms of the cultural ecosystem services and benefits. Those were fairly uniform across the way, maybe with some slight differences in interpretation or how that, you know, came to fall under that theme. Some of the things that I did notice that were different from location to location a bit more. A lot of it sort of thinking about management. And so up in Massachusetts was unique in the town level approach to it. And I was there at the time when the shellfish associations of the commercial shellfishermen of Wellfleet were challenged with the state level shellfish initiative that was happening. And so I happened to be there when they were mobilizing against that. And so that was something that was different that, you know, no one else was managing at the town level in the places that I visited. I also started the project, you know, initially starting in Maryland, where there's this perception of opposition from watermen. And so my project initially started looking at why watermen weren't getting into aquaculture. For those who did, why did they decide to get into it? For those that didn't, what were some of those factors? And when I ended up, because I was also doing this livelihood diversification part of it, and what I found was that in Maryland and Virginia, the number of watermen or commercial fishermen that were involved was actually much higher relative to the Gulf of Mexico, for example. And it was a little different up in New England and Massachusetts and Rhode Island, where there were people that sort of still had their hands in both. But in the Gulf, a lot of the folks that were getting into this young industry didn't come from commercial fisheries, except for Cedar Key as the exception, where they did shift in after the net ban. And so there was a lot of things that I guess were shaped more by management and regulatory environment that were affecting how the industries were growing in each place.
Oh, okay. So geography is an exogenous variable in that case. Cool. Have we got
And they were
another
certainly
question?
growing differently in different places,
Oh, yeah.
like using different gear and approaches.
Oh, right. Let's see. We can take we have some time for an extra couple questions, perhaps. Anybody want to drop one in the chat? I want to make sure I'm not missing one.
This is Bob.
Hey, Bob.
I have a naive question. I know very little about this subject, but what about quality of product, wild versus farmed raised? When I go to the store, I never buy farm raised salmon. I buy wild salmon, but I'm sure that's different depending on the fishery. Do you have any comment on that?
So in terms of quality, that sort of again depends on perspective, depends on who you ask. I would say for most of the farm product, not all, but a lot of the farm product is going to the half shell market, whereas a lot of the wild product is going to the shucked market. And so that sort of generally in the US is what we see, that the farmed oysters are more likely what you're getting in an oyster bar compared to what you're eating on an oyster po' boy, for example. But it also varies by region. So down, in some of the Gulf states, people want a big wild oyster rather than the more petite farmed oyster. And so that was one of the hurdles that the industry had getting started, was trying to address the fact that most of their local population wanted the big wild. And I think that they've succeeded that, and people are doing both, but they're not necessarily not competitive markets against one another, but different sort of targets for those products.
Okay, thank you.
We got a couple in the chat. What's the fear of watermen and aquaculture developers putting all the work into aquaculture and having die-offs or oxygen nutrient issues limiting viability? That's from David.
So I think maybe this is touching on recent unexplained mortality events that are happening. So on the Atlantic coast, as well as on the Pacific and in the Gulf, I'm more familiar with what's been happening along the Atlantic and Gulf coast, but there have been some unexplained mortalities, and it's not limited to a single state or a single location or body of water, that the science is suggesting that it's a multi-stressor system. So it's not just one thing, but that it's sort of all these things piling up on top of each other that's making it tough for oysters in particular to struggle. And so to survive, and you may have these mortality events. And so I think it certainly is a concern of the industry, and trying to predict an unexplained mortality event is tough because we don't know exactly what's driving it. But there's a lot of research that's happening. There's a lot of collaborative work with the industry to work to try to solve this and think about husbandry practices, at least, that can help reduce that risk and mitigate it.
It's a good question. John has a question. Can individual personality differences of participants act as a confounding variable in that type of study?
I mean, I think it could, but for this, so I was trying to get at the benefits people get from their work, and did have a pretty sizable sample. And so I'd be less concerned that there were personality differences. I think it would sort of tie in. So for example, the benefit number 46, the shell collection. So that was somebody who was a hobbyist that got into oyster farming so that she could build her shell collection with her own oysters, in addition to selling them for product. But so that was something that was important to her, but clearly didn't resonate with the rest of the group. So I think that the personality differences would just showcase, and maybe if something came up that was important for a small group of people, that didn't rank high for the others.
Mm. Mm. You have another minute or two. If anybody else has a question, squeeze one in. I'm thinking about the climate change kind of question, because you've got a transition in industry growth and a new industry that's younger, but you have those folks that came into it from wild fishing and the, climate and other factors,
Mhm.
affecting that. That's it. I think you're kind of getting good baseline cultural information uh, that doesn't always have itself available in historically in wild fisheries, right?
Right. And with climate change, that was actually part of my Maryland work originally. When I started doing interviews in Maryland that were focused on resilience, was thinking about resilience in the face of a changing environment. And at the time, so that was in 2016, most of the folks that I talked with either didn't think anything was changing or that they had way too many other things to worry about before that. So they were trying to keep their business afloat. Many were within the first 5 years of starting an oyster farm. And so climate change was not high on the radar. I've started to sort of informally circle back and have been talking with others for some of these other projects, like the labor demand project. We're not focused on climate change, but I've had the opportunity to talk with shellfish growers about it and seeing how there's a difference in the, not quite a decade of how people are thinking about it and if they are.
Okay.